The Black Death, an event of epical significance spanning the mid-14th century, stands as one of the most catastrophic pandemics in human history, profoundly reshaping the demographic, economic, religious, and cultural landscape of Europe and Asia. Its terrifying journey and devastating impact from approximately 1347 to 1350 marked a pivotal moment, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the medieval world, an event so severe that the European population would not recover its pre-14th century levels until the 16th century. The scientific consensus among historians and microbiologists identifies the primary causative agent as the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a pathogen whose evolution is traced back thousands of years. This bacterium was transmitted primarily by the fleas Xenopsilla chiapis carried by black rats Rattus rattus, which were ubiquitous in the unhygienic urban and commercial centers of the era. However, crucial modern research suggests the rapid and widespread inland transmission, especially in cooler northern climates, may be better explained by human fleas and body lice, as the oriental rat flea has poor survival in cold weather, reinforcing the idea that the disease was spread directly from person to person as pneumonic plague. The pandemic manifested in three clinical forms: the bubonic form, the most common, characterized by painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes or gavocholos, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck, accompanied by high fevers and dark prognostic signs like black spots, acral gangrene on the skin. The pneumonic form, a far deadlier strain that attacked the lungs and was highly contagious, spreading directly through the air via coughing. And the septicemic form, which infected the bloodstream, leading to rapid systemic failure and death often before buboes could even develop, lending the disease its notorious dark severity. The epidemiological origin of the plague traces back to the vast steppe regions of Central Asia, specifically identified by genetic evidence as originating in the Tian Shan Mountains near the border of Kyrgyzstan and China. The disease surged into the human population during the 1340s, primarily facilitated by the extensive Silk Road trade networks, though the precise timing and route remain debated, with some evidence of a sudden surge of deaths occurring in Kyrgyzstan in the late 1330s, nearly 2 decades before the primary European wave. From its initial foothold in the Golden Horde territories, particularly around the Volga River and the Black Sea, the disease was carried westward. A commonly cited key event in its transmission was the siege of the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, modern Feodosia, in the Crimea in 1346. According to the account of Gabriela de Musi, the besieging Mongol army, led by Yani Beg, suffering heavily from the plague, allegedly used early biological warfare by catapulting the infected corpses over the city walls. While the historical accuracy of this specific biological attack remains contested, it undeniably illustrates that the plague had reached the critical junction of the maritime trade routes. Fleeing Genoese merchants carried the contagion by ship out of the Black Sea to Constantinople, where it arrived in the summer of 1347, quickly claiming the life of the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine Emperor, John VI Kantakouzenos. The plague arrived in Europe via the Mediterranean Sea in October 1347, when Genoese trading vessels, often described as death ships, docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The crews were either dead or gravely ill, covered in black swellings. The disease rapidly spread inland. By January 1348, it had reached the major port of Marseilles in France and the Italian centers of Pisa and Venice. The most densely populated and commercially active areas were hit hardest and earliest. Florence, the banking and cultural heart of Italy, suffered terribly. Giovanni Boccaccio, who chronicled the plague in his introduction to the Decameron, vividly described the social collapse, the breakdown of communal responsibility, and the city's grim state where families abandoned the sick and bodies lay unburied in the streets. By spring 1348, the plague was consuming mainland Europe. It reached the Iberian Peninsula, devastating cities like Valencia and Barcelona. The infection followed major roads, rivers, and shipping lanes. It struck Paris in the summer of 1348, causing widespread panic and a huge spike in mortality, overwhelming established systems of governance and sanitation, which were already abysmal due to common practices like dumping waste into the streets. The disease reached England in the summer of 1348, likely landing at the port of Melcombe Regis, modern Weymouth in Dorset. It then traveled rapidly along the southern coast and up into the interior. Reaching London by 1349, the infection continued its relentless march, sweeping through Scandinavia and eventually reaching as far as Iceland and Greenland via trade routes in the early 1350s. The entire primary wave of the pandemic in Europe was largely complete by 1352, although it would return in successive, smaller cycles for centuries, a pattern confirming its endemic persistence. The mortality rates associated with the Black Death were unprecedented, estimated conservatively at 30% to 60% of the entire European population. Some regions, particularly urban centers like Florence, Paris, and parts of England, may have lost up to 70 to 80% of their inhabitants, while the Middle East lost approximately 33% of its population. The overall demographic toll across Europe is estimated to be around 25 million to 50 million deaths. The immediate consequence was profound social disorganization. Basic services collapsed, crops rotted in the fields due to a lack of laborers. Law and order disintegrated in many areas as local officials and magistrates died, and the traditional rites of burial and mourning were abandoned, leading to the creation of vast hastily dug mass graves, further fueling panic and despair. The psychological impact was immense, characterized by a pervasive sense of doom leading to extremes of behavior, reckless hedonism, and debauchery on one hand, based on the fatalistic logic that life was short, and God's judgment inevitable and fervent, often violent piety on the other. The flagellants represented one of the most striking religious reactions. These groups of penitents marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins, which they believed had provoked God's wrath in the form of the plague. Their defiance of local clerical authority and extreme fanaticism ultimately led to their movement being condemned by Pope Clement VI in 1349. A darker, more tragic consequence was the search for scapegoats. Fueled by mass hysteria and pre-existing anti-Semitic prejudices, communities across Europe, particularly in Germany and the Low Countries, turned violently against Jewish communities, falsely accusing them of poisoning wells to deliberately spread the pestilence. Despite official protection offered by Pope Clement VI, who recognized the falseness of the accusations, massive pogroms erupted, culminating in horrific massacres like those in Strasbourg in 1349, where hundreds were burned alive, forcing many Jews to flee eastward into the safer havens of Poland and Lithuania. Economically, the plague triggered a seismic shift from the established feudal order. The massive death toll resulted in a severe, chronic labor shortage. Previously, peasants were tied to the land, their labor cheap and plentiful. Suddenly, the surviving workers found themselves in a position of power, able to demand significantly higher wages and better working conditions. Land, previously the source of all wealth and power, became cheap and often lay fallow. Feudal lords attempted to suppress these changes through coercive legislation, such as the Statute of Laborers issued in England in 1351, which attempted to fix wages and mobility at pre-plague levels. However, such efforts were largely unsuccessful. The inexorable market forces created by mass death proved unstoppable, leading directly to the widespread decline of serfdom, agrarian revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, and the rise of the nascent middle class and the commercial economy. The Church, despite its immense power, was deeply affected. The epidemic spared no one, including the clergy, who died at high rates due to their constant exposure to the sick while administering last rites. This massive loss necessitated the rapid, often desperate, recruitment and ordination of poorly trained, often less devout, replacements. The spiritual authority of the church was also undermined. People questioned why the devout died alongside the wicked, and why the elaborate structures of institutional prayer offered no protection. This spiritual crisis contributed to the rise of personal piety, lay religious movements, and a growing intellectual movement toward the questioning of ecclesiastical authority, which would characterize the later Renaissance and set the stage for the Reformation. Culturally and artistically, the Black Death cemented an obsession with death and mortality. This is reflected in the pervasive artistic motif known as the _danse macabre _dance of death, which depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from emperors and popes to peasants and children, to their graves, emphasizing the universality and impartiality of death. Literature, most famously Boccaccio's Decameron, which used the plague as a backdrop for tales of human resilience and wit, also grappled with the theme. In medicine, the pandemic exposed the profound limitations of contemporary medical knowledge, which was dominated by the humoral theory inherited from Galen. Physicians could offer little effective treatment, relying on ineffective methods like bloodletting, the lancing of buboes, and the burning of aromatic herbs to ward off the imagined miasma. The shock of the plague eventually spurred a greater emphasis on observation, dissection, and empirical study in medical practice, though this fundamental shift in scientific methodology took decades to materialize fully. Furthermore, the Black Death is recognized by historians as the beginning of the second plague pandemic, which would continue to reappear in epidemic form across Europe for centuries, notably with the Great Plague of London in 1665. The Black Death of 1347 c. 1352 was not merely a tragic episode of disease. It was a demographic cataclysm that acted as a powerful accelerant of historical change. It rapidly dismantled the rigid social, political, and economic structures of the High Middle Ages, empowering the labor class, weakening the feudal aristocracy, challenging the institutional church, and instigating profound shifts in European thought, art, and identity, setting the irreversible stage for the societal transformations of the early modern period.